welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In the series on sociological research method, in today's lecture, I am going to discuss on part 3, part 4 of comparative methods. In the first and second part, we discussed on Andre Bette's contribution to comparative method. Today, we are trying to understand Radcliffe Brown, who was one of the founding figures of social anthropology, and how he tried to help us understand comparative method as a research methodology for undergoing field works in social anthropology. So basically, Radcliffe Brown was working at a time when most of the British anthropologists had this distinction between sociology and anthropology. And for them, anthropology was studying the other society. So these anthropologists were going to primitive society and undergoing doing research, and Radcliffe done field work in the Andaman Islander, and he was under the opinion that in order to kind of find out universal rules that helps us to understand the structures of society, it is important to compare. And the intent or the objective was to find universal ways in which society are socially organized. So let us look into the third part of comparative method, and here we begin by understanding that Radcliffe Brown, A.R. Radcliffe Brown, a prominent British social anthropologist, utilized the comparative method as a foundational approach in his research. This method involved systematically comparing social structure, institutions, and practices across different societies to identify patterns, regularities, and underlying principle. So, because he was under the impression of unifying rules that could help us to understand the way in which structures function. So when we read Radcliffe Brown, we also keep in mind that he was the functionalist, and he was also working at a time when sociology, social anthropologists were being developed as very similar to the physical sciences. So we will see in his study that he is kind of making reference to organic analogy, and that is why he was kind of against the whole idea of reconstructing the origin of social system, especially for societies which lacked historical records. And here the study is being done among the Australian Aborigine, among the Andaman Islanders. There are no kind of a written records, and even Durkheim makes reference to totem, where the society was divided in terms of the classification according to birds and animals, and therefore making reference to the origin of social system is kind of difficult. And therefore the ethnological comparison or historical reconstruction was something that he said would enable the researcher to establish historical connections and reconstruct the history of the society, people, or origin. When similar institutions, customs, or beliefs are found in two or more societies, an ethnologist might interpret this as evidence of a shared origin, diffusion, or historical relationship between them. Now, how is social anthropology different from ethnology? And that is kind of making reference to the theoretical analysis. And in that, social anthropologists explore varieties of forms of social life as a basis for the theoretical study of human phenomena. The aim of social anthropologists, unlike the ethnology, is to trace historical link, but to understand the underlying principles, functions, and variations of social institutions across different culture. It's about developing general theories about human society. So on one side, the ethnologists are only kind of reconstructing history. They are able to connect the present to the past through a historical trace. And if you look into ethnology, James Fraser, the study of his book The Golden Bough, is an example of ethnological method. Whereas a social anthropologist, they are not only trying to kind of go back to the past, but they're trying to understand certain unifying principles which helps us to understand the general theories of how society functions. Here Radcliffe Brown gives us the example of the study of kinship system, and here we have seen as students of sociology and anthropology that when we study kinship, we generally compare the kinship of one society to the other, and therefore we have a patrilineal society, a matrilineal society, or in India we compare the North kinship system to the South kinship system, and after comparing, the objective is to understand how society organize relationship and inheritance in different societies. Radcliffe Brown makes reference to Franz Boas' contribution in the period of 1880 to 1896, and he says that according to Franz Boas, the anthropology had two tasks. One, historical reconstruction, the first task, and the focus on particular histories of people or region. This aligns with ethnology and historical particularism. Franz Boas was cautious about sweeping generalization and stressed contextual detail studies. The second task or the second part of anthropology was for comparative analysis of social life. Boas noted that despite cultural differences, there are underlying regularities in how culture developed. This suggests the existence of general law or pattern in cultural evolution. This aligns more with social anthropology or comparative sociology. Franz Boas further distinguished between ethnology and social anthropology as used in different contexts. Boas notes that the same customs or ideas can appear among people who have no historical connections. This means a shared origin, that is, diffusion or common ancestry, cannot explain their similarities. This observation forces anthropologists to consider whether they are laws that result in the same or at least similar phenomena independently of historical causes. Now, this second important task, according to Franz Boas, is therefore the investigation of laws governing social life. Franz Boas believed that the frequent occurrence of similar phenomena in historically unconnected culture suggests that the human mind develops everywhere according to the same laws. So, keep in mind, Radcliffe Brown, being one of the founding figures, is trying to develop anthropology very close to the physical sciences like biology, and therefore the attempt here is in terms of arriving at grand laws, universal law that could help understand the social structures of society. So, the belief was that there could be variance, but then there are similarities which would help us to look into these laws governing social life. This implies a universal human psychology or underlying principles that lead to similar cultural expression. Franz Boas himself viewed these two tasks, that is, historical reconstruction and the discovery of social laws, as belonging to a single discipline, which he interchangeably called anthropology or ethnology. For him, these were two facets of understanding human culture, though the terms have been used differently. Ethnology was reserved for investigations concerned with the reconstruction of history, and this, as we have already discussed, was the first task according to Franz Boas. Social anthropology, which is investigation laws which govern social life, is the second important task and is used by anthropologists to discover regularity in the development of human society, particularly as illustrated or demonstrated by the study of primitive people. This aligned with Boas' second task, the search for laws governing social life. In some academic traditions, particularly British, the term ethnology and social anthropology became specialized to denote the two distinct comparative purposes. The first, historical reconstruction, and the second, the study of social regularity. So, it is very clear, ethnology is the task of historical reconstruction, and anthropologists are trying to arrive at laws helping to understand universal ways in which social orders are regulated. Now, after discussing the distinction between ethnology and social anthropology, he talks about armchair anthropologists and the way they have used comparative method. Now, before we discuss, armchair anthropologists are those who are kind of in the department, university, in doing research, not going to the field. So, armchair versus say the field workers or the observers, researchers who go to the field and do research, whereas armchair anthropologists would refer to books and literature existing on the subject and arrive at their theory. So, the text states that the comparative method in social anthropology is characteristic of those referred to as armchair anthropologists. These scholars work primarily in libraries rather than conducting field work. The initial task is to identify parallels, similar social features or institutions that appear in different societies, regardless of whether the society exists in the present or historical past. Fraser is referred as a prime example of an armchair anthropologist who used this comparative method. His work involved extensive comparison of myths, rituals, and beliefs from diverse culture, all primarily from existing written sources. Fraser's armchair anthropology is contrasted with the advocacy of Haddon, who emphasized the need for intensive studies of particular society through systematic fieldwork conducted by competent observer. This marks a shift towards direct immersive research in the culture being studied. So, we see a shift in terms of the armchair anthropologists sitting in the library or in their research room and are doing comparison of society based on the reading of existing literature. And then there is a shift towards the anthropologists who start kind of not content with the existing literature, but they themselves go to the field and study the society and then kind of arrive at the similarity and differences. So, this development and prominence of field studies led to the relative neglect of studies that primarily utilize the comparative method. Now, the comparative method were trying to arrive at universal laws, whereas those going to the field and doing their respective field study were focused on the particular specificity of the society which they were studying. So, there is a shift from universal theorization of society to particular descriptive analysis of the society being studied. Now, this shift is deemed both understandable and excusable, implying that fieldwork offers distinct advantages or addresses different research questions more effectively. This suggests that despite the benefits of fieldwork, the decline of comparative method might lead to some negative consequences or missed opportunity in anthropological understanding. However, Brown, he was kind of looking into the more use of comparative method, and therefore he argues for a balanced approach in anthropological study and combining both contextualized fieldwork with systematic comparative analysis. Because just studying a society by itself without making reference say to either the past of the same society or to other society would then be incomplete. So, Brown laments that students are taught to understand social features within the context of a specific social system, but often not within the wider context of human societies in general. This implies a lack of broader theoretical ambition. Cambridge School of Anthropology around 1900 to 1910 did not advocate abandoning armchair anthropology. So, as much as the field based data is relevant, it is also important to go back to the literature and look into the study which has already been done on a different society or in a different historical period, and look into the ways where there could be some similarities and differences. So, they believed they must be combined with intensive studies of particular primitive society. The goal of these intensive study was to examine any particular institution's custom or belief in relation to the total social system of which it was part of or item. So, when we try to understand functional approach or functionalism as a method of understanding, we know there was a kind of a reference to the part and whole. So, the society is the whole and all the institutions there are kind of a part, and each part is connected to the whole and are contributing to the functioning and the maintenance of status or social order. So, this was kind of a very brief understanding of how Radcliffe Brown, belonging to the functionalist school, is emphasizing the way in which you need to kind of compare, use comparative method in order to have a more holistic understanding. So, this highlights the importance of understanding functionality and interrelationship within a single society. Radcliffe Brown issues a strong warning. Without systematic comparative study, anthropology will become only historiography and ethnography. Historiography generally focuses solely on the unique history of a particular group, and ethnography focuses solely on the detailed description of particular culture. This suggests that while these are valuable, they are not sufficient for anthropology to develop generalizable insight or theories. So, basically he advocated the use of comparison along with intensive field work of a particular society. So, he was a strong advocate of comparative method, where he was in terms of suggesting the use of comparison for kind of developing sociological theory, and that is why he said sociological theory must be based on and continually tested by systematic comparison. This emphasizes the crucial role of comparison in developing and validating universal principles about human society. To demonstrate the comparative method, Radcliffe Brown provides illustration of the case study of the tribes in New South Wales, which is Australia. The population here is divided into two parts named Eagle Hawk and Crow. Now, when you read his methods of social anthropology, we see that he is continuously making references to pair of birds, and not only in Australia but other parts of the society as well, where the comparison is to see that these eagle hawk and crow are kind of like opponents, and the similar way the society is also classified as opposing group. Basically the totem groups are opposed to each other, and in terms of an analogy, he says that just as they are kind of a relationship, though they are opposing each other and are conflicting, but are part of the social structure. So, he uses this analogy to understand the way in which this moieties or division of society into two groups were kind of classified, and one of the relevance of classification of society into moieties or clan was to kind of establish rules of marriage. So, when we do kinship and marriage, and we've read about rules like exogamy and endogamy, these rules were based on classification of the society into two opposing group, and therefore the men had to marry outside their own moiety or division. So, the case study tells us that children belonging to their mother's division. So, it's a kind of an focus on matrilineal descent, and the children belong to the mother's group. This system is described as totemically represented exogamous matrilineal moieties. Exogamous, men are marrying outside the group. Matrilineal, the line of descent is through the mother, children belong to the mother's group. Now, Radcliffe Brown acknowledges that one way to explain a society's feature is through its history. However, for Australian tribes like the New South Wales example, there is no authentic history. That is, there are no written records or oral tradition going back far enough. This forces historical anthropologists to resort to imaginary histories. And what are these imaginary histories? These imaginary histories are constructed through say folk tales and stories narrated in terms of the division of the plants, the animals, and here the reference is to the Rev. John Matthews' hypothetical explanation for the eagle hawk and the crow division. He supposes two distinct people, eagle hawk and crows, met, fought, made peace, and then agreed to intermarry. eagle hawk men marrying crow women, and vice versa. Instead of inventing history, it is important to shift to the core of the comparative method and discover parallels. So, by comparing these pairs of birds, he is kind of also discovering universal rules through which he can understand the social structures of society. Now, the first parallel that he found was the Haida people of Northwest America. Striking similarity with Australian tribes, they also have a division into two exogamous matrilineal moieties, meaning marriage outside one division, and children belong to the mother's division. Their divisions are named after the eagle and the raven, which are presented as very close ecological and symbolical equivalent to Australia's eagle hawk and crow. Hyder's legend connected to the division. The text provides a significant Hyder myth. In the beginning, the eagle controlled all fresh water. The raven stole the water from the eagle. As the raven flew, the water spilled, forming lakes and rivers, providing water for all birds and salmon for humans. The author, that is Ratcliffe Brown, presented this Hyder example not to suggest a direct historical link between Australian tribes and the Hyder, but rather to highlight the reoccurrence of similar structural features. And what are these recurrent structural features, or rather what he could have considered as universal features? Exogamous matrilineal moieties named after competing birds in widely separated culture. So, when we read this anthropological text, whether it be Emile Durkheim, Evans Pritchard, or Ratcliffe Brown, we see that there is a kind of an reliance of imaginary narratives where they are kind of trying to understand that there were no written records and people were kind of based on their memories in terms of identifying themselves as belonging to a particular moiety, clan or totemic group, and this identification was through the totem, which could be a symbolic representation in the form of a bird and an animal, and this then structured the relation between the two groups in terms of the everyday life interaction as well as negotiating alliances. Now, the Hyder example that is being given here is a kind of a depiction of a primordial conflict and resolution between the eagle and the raven, might offer a symbolic explanation or charter for their social division, which could be functionally similar to how Australian divisions operate, even if their specific origin myths differ. This comparison is being set up to explore underlying principles or social functions, not shared history. Ratcliffe Brown also discusses a similar legend existing in Australia concerning the eagle hawk and the crow, mirroring the Hyder myth. So, when he is discussing about these examples, he is basically trying to, as I already said, arrive at an analogy between what was happening in the, say, the animal worlds and kind of referring it to the similar modus operandi to understand the ways in which the social order was maintained through the division into moieties. So, he then directly introduces the diffusionist, specifically naming Grabner. So, the diffuseness criteria is that if we accept the criteria formulated by diffuseness such as Grabner, we have here what they would say is evidence of a historical connection between Australia, Pacific and the Pacific coast of North America. By presenting the extreme parallel, the author is implicitly setting up a critique of alternative interpretation to the diffusionist conclusion. Now, the diffusionists are of opinion that the kind of these behaviors, despite the differences in terms of the social order to which they belong, these patterns kind of diffuse throughout the society, and therefore in different variants, but the cultural pattern would be found in every society. So, the diffusionist would argue that such detailed and specific similarity must include the idea spread from one region to the other, or that both share a very ancient common origin. However, Given the immense geographical and temporal separation, such a direct historical connection is highly improbable. The author is likely leading towards an explanation based on independent invention, universal human cognitive processes, or similar social functions rather than direct historical contact. So, we have gone through the understanding of Rattle Brown, and he continues to broaden the scope of comparative method, moving beyond the direct Australian header parallel to explore patterns within Australia, and then introduces a new type of dichotomy of society represented by birds. Rattle Brown emphasizes that once you start looking, similar exogamous moiety, which we know that moiety means division of the society into two parts, which is basically a rule for not marrying the other group. And this is a kind of feature or a characteristic that you will find when you pick up any social anthropology book of the founding fathers, where they were studying these primitive society. It's kind of a universal description of society divided into these exogamous groups. So, these divisions are frequently named after or represented by birds. And we have seen through a number of explanation that he is doing. So, to come to the conclusion of the lecture, we know that Rattle Brown, belonging to the functionalist, was kind of developing social anthropology and emphasized on use of comparative method to arrive at certain classifying features that could help us to invent universal rules that could regulate and maintain the social structure. So, when we kind of look into Rattle Brown, we keep in mind that he is a functionalist, emphasizes the use of comparative method, and the most important that he is trying to focus on how the structures of society and order is maintained. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.